Funnily enough, today is my anniversary. 14 years ago I purchased the ferry. So the history of the Pink Ferry is actually quite vast, really. Yeah. I mean, we're one of the oldest passenger ferries in the country. There's a book which a local Hamble resident has made up, giving detailed documents of factual crossings. One of the earliest recorded crossings was in 1492, and that was I think it was raised in the Magna Carta as well. There's numerous points throughout history where there's a mention of the Hamble to Warsash ferry being used by kings, by royalty, where they would tow the horses behind the ferries, because it's a long way. You're talking, hundreds of years ago. To cross the river, you'd have to walk all the way up to Botley, because there was no other bridge. So this was quite an important link in those times, because it would probably be at least a day's walk around the river. There's various documentation and evidence of crossings, but there's far more early 18th century and 19th, 20th century where it starts to become more interesting. And we have a solid history of families that would own and run the business, and then it was then taken over in the early 19th century by a brewery, which was quite nice for the ferrymen, because they would sit and have a pint and then row people across the river. So quite a relaxed way of life then. And then we're skipping up to more present times. Ray Sedgwick, who is the longest recorded ferryman, longest serving ferryman. He's now pushing 80 years old, and he first helped his grandfather down here when he was 9. So he's been working at it for sort of 70 odd years. He purchased the business himself when he was 20, and he's still working here today. He worked for about 50 years without a single day off. He never married. He married the business, and his first day off was when he was quite poorly and had a heart attack. But then he was in hospital unconscious for about 3 days, and I had a phone call from the hospital from the nurse saying Mr. Sedgwick's very distressed, he's just woken up, come round, and he's worried about who's running the ferry. And that was his first thoughts when he came round, which is a nice thing. But yeah, he's still here today. He works a couple of days a week on a voluntary basis, and it just keeps him active. It's what he wants to do. A big highlight would be when the ferry moved from the ferry hard at this side to the public pontoon at Hamble. It was a big move then. Basically, we will use a ferry hard, which is basically the seabed. When the tide goes out, the boat runs up to that, and people step on and off. It's quite an old-fashioned way of doing things, and the ferry hard has been in place since the first recorded crossings, and that's what it was built for. So it's hundreds of years old, and it was a milestone when Hamble Quay was built, because it modernised things. It made the crossing much longer. It was twice as long. However, it was much more accessible to people, so it was much easier. So that was a big milestone when things changed. Another milestone is moving from rowing to engines, because the boats obviously used to be rowed, and now we're using engines. It started off with outboard engines, now we're using diesel inboard engines as well, so just little tiny boats that potter backwards and forwards across the river. Ray was still rowing boats when he was a child. He purchased the ferry in the early 50s, and that was still being rowed then. So mid to late 50s, he obviously decided that rowing wasn't a good idea, so he put an engine on the back of the boat, and then moved on to inboard engines. So early 60s, inboard engines were used. The little ferry, Claire sank in 1987, and that was the only time we've had any issues, touch wood, with the boats. And we got a local fisherman in, and they slung the boat and lifted it up on one of the beam trawlers. So it was nice and easy in that respect. I'm not quite so sure we'd be able to do that these days, due to regulations, but it worked quite nicely. Surprisingly enough, we have a lot of interesting crossings for people. I've done now probably 5 weddings where people want their guests to be transported across the river to their venues. I think it was last year we actually decked the big ferry out with ribbons and bows for a married couple who were being transported to the RAF Yacht Club, where their guests were waiting for them. So we took them, we painted up the boat nicely, we took them and they arrived by boat into the RAF Yacht Club. So that was quite nice for them. Yeah, so we do weddings. Funerals as well. Lots of people like Hamble and like the river, and we do a reasonable amount of scattering of ashes on the river. So we would just take people out on the ferry route, a group of people, switch the engine off. They would then say their goodbyes and disperse or just scatter the ashes into the river.
Year in and year out, she's crossing the Hamble River, probably one of the most expensive and famous rivers in the world. So how many passengers are you actually taking?
We're talking probably around about 30,000 people a year, around about that sort of figure. It varies sometimes, but yeah, so say between 20 and 30,000 people a year. And we've been doing that for, well, I've been doing that for 14 years. Now there was a big change actually when the ferry moved to the pontoon. That did help with trade. I think it became a bit more visible because down here it's a bit tucked out of the way, but up there it's more visible. So that did help. And yeah, so say we do. So 10 years, we're talking probably 300,000 people maybe. And a lot of that is just tourists. We used to offer a service for people travelling to work in the morning. We start at 6 o'clock. However, there was like 4 or 5 people coming, and then if it was raining, they wouldn't turn up. So we decided that actually wasn't really important. So we just standard hours now. But we have a lot of people in the summer.
And do you sit here in the office with your binoculars looking over at Warsash every day for customers?
We have to, yeah, we're on a line of sight, so we have to look out for people. We've since updated, so we've got a phone number. If someone wants to cross the river, we will, there's a phone number and that will get through directly to the boat. You can call for that. I don't know many ferry services that are actually on demand like that, so you just literally phone up and we'll come across and get you. There's not a timetable. Our timetable is from 9 o'clock in the morning until 4 o'clock in the evening, and we're just on demand. Today's a nice day. 4 o'clock in the winter is pretty bleak down here, and I've done surveys, passenger numbers, to work out when the core travel times are. So winter times, basically it's daylight hours in the winter. 4 o'clock we would stop, and then in the summer we work till 6 o'clock. A little bit later in the evening, and then there's a river taxi in the evening that will take over from that, so that people can still cross and go to the pub or go to the restaurant, have dinner, something like that. What keeps me here is the lifestyle. It's relaxed. It's nice to work outside. It is bleak here, but in the summer it's lovely. We work hard. Particularly in the summer, but it's a labour of love. Yes, it is a labour of love because I've been doing it now for the best part of 15 years, and I love it. I work most days. It's what I want to do. It's what I choose to do. I'm never going to be a rich man, but I make a living, make a steady living, and keep a couple of guys employed as well, which obviously helps. I just enjoy it. I enjoy working on the water. And I enjoy the challenges of everyday business. It's nice. It takes the crossing takes around about 8 minutes each way, and then you obviously got loading and unloading on both sides. The distance has now doubled. We're talking around about 700 metres now, that's an 800 metres. But it depends on what state of tide it is. If the tide's up, it's actually a little bit further because the boat has to travel further. If the tide is low, the boat doesn't have to travel quite so far.
You go into any pub in Hamble and ask the question, why is the ferry pink? Everyone would come up with a different answer. So what is the truth? How did this little ferry suddenly turn pink?
How it turned pink is a good question. I've been asked that many times. I think it was in 2001, my brother and I were thinking of purchasing the business. It wasn't doing particularly well, and having dinner with my twin brother and my younger brother and with my mum, and we were thinking of ideas of raising the profile. My brother is a designer who works in the city, and he just made a flippant comment one day and he said, "Paint it pink." And I was like, no, that's really not a good plan. And he sort of said that, he said, but that's a really good way of raising the profile immediately. And I went away, thought about it, and thought, actually, that's not a bad idea. So I had more discussions with him, and he said, be aware that people are going to struggle with that because it's a big change. And lo and behold, they did. But we changed the colour in 2002, and immediately it hit the local press, and local residents were interested, so it generated a lot more interest in the ferry that way. So that is the reason why it's painted pink. There's a common misconception that we've got a job lot of cheap pink paint. That is not the case. It was chosen on purpose. So immediately there was interest, and some of it was very negative. However, it's still interest, and trying to put the ferry on the map. If you Google Pink Ferry now, the first thing that comes up is our ferry down here. So it has helped definitely raise the interest of the ferry. There was plenty of backlash. There was graffiti done to the ferry shelter on the Warsash side, but it was actually done quite tastefully. They had painted big yellow spots on the ferry shelter to make it look like Mr. Blobby, which I thought was really quite amusing. So I took some photographs of that as well, and that's one in my scrapbook. So there was a bit of backlash on that. The residents on the Warsash side were very unsupportive at first of us painting the ferry shelter pink, because they said it ruined their view across the nature reserve. However, I spoke to them and said, we need to raise the profile of this business, so that's what we did. I've had a letter from Canada, I believe it is, people asking for our book, to see about the history, because they're interested in that. We've been mentioned in the House of Lords. The little pink ferry was mentioned in the House of Lords, and we've been on Top Gear, we've been on Charlie Dimmock's River Walks, we've been on the news numerous times. So the front of Ideal Homes magazine, on the front of that for a pink building. So there's been a reasonable amount of publicity, and I think that's a lot of that to do with the colour. Top Gear they were filming down here for the Toy Boater Challenge, and they were filming in the river, and there were several shots of the ferry crossing the river there, and James May decided to plough his dinghy into all of our moorings and dent some boats, but it was all in good humour. It was a good taste. We were mentioned in the House of Lords. There's a lord on the river who uses his boat here, and he's very friendly with Ray Sedgwick, who is the longest serving ferryman we have. He's been doing this for about 70 years, I think, and he mentioned it as a supportive comment about the pink ferry helping local community and helping local businesses. So it was a nice thing for him to do. Interestingly, changing the colour, I've often said to people jokingly, the next colour will be lime green, because that's an outstanding colour. I don't think it's going to change. It's interestingly enough, when we did change it, the boats were white, Now they're pink. I think that if we changed it back to white, people would complain now, because people know the pink ferry. That's what it's called, the pink ferry. And there is no plans at the moment. It's our branding. That's what we are. We're never going to be millionaires doing this job. It's a lifestyle, but it certainly did help. There's no doubt about that. It helped keep passenger numbers are very steady. So we're not massively busy, but we can earn a modest living of what we do. If we hadn't changed it pink, I do wonder whether the ferry would still be here. Bearing in mind we don't get any subsidy or any help from local authority or transport authority or anything. We're completely independent. So it was a good move, I feel, changing things pink. Yes, so there's we've got numerous things to do with the pink ferry, and very few of them have actually been anything to do with me. I haven't instigated any of it, which I actually take as a compliment, because people see this as a I think icon's the wrong word, but a point of interest in the local community. So there was a local guy who was making models of the ferry. There's one here, all handmade, and they were sold in a gift shop up in Hamble, along with a model of the ferry shelter, which is in Warsash. We've got mouse mats, fridge magnets, postcards, photographs, pictures. There's a small book as well, all to do with the ferry. And what's great about that is all of it is pink. Everything is pink. So the idea of when we were sat around the dinner table discussing pink paint, in my eyes, has actually pulled off.